In this lesson, I'm going to give you some background on William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. And in this lesson, I want you to understand the difference between Shakespeare's tragedies and comedies. I'm going to give you a brief review of reading strategies for dealing with Shakespeare, a brief introduction to the play, and finally some connections to the learning objectives for your reading of the play. So Shakespeare wrote in three different modes, right? Comedies, which usually end the conflict with a marriage or a series of marriages. Histories, which dramatize real events from history, or what we may call historical fiction. And finally, tragedies, that usually end the conflict with murders or suicides. And so this time we're going to look at a comedy. So let's look at comedies versus tragedies, right? Because the real question here is, how do you heal a community? Some scholars have talked about, that's what Shakespeare's plots are about, is healing communities. So we can really heal communities in two ways. It's through life or death, right? Life is, through marriage, which implies childbirth, or death, which is, kind of eliminating toxic elements. People like Macbeth and Iago and, Othello when he kind of goes bad. So comedies versus tragedies, right? And Merchant of Venice is, I'm going to back up here for a second. Merchant of Venice is a comedy, right? It's going to end with a series of marriages. It's a love story. A lot of students rightly complain that every time they read Shakespeare, it's all about murder and death and suicide and what's wrong with this guy. So, we're going to look at Merchant of Venice because I want you to see a comedy, although it's not a perfect comedy, as I'll talk about later. So remember our reading strategies for Shakespeare. I've talked about this in previous lessons, when we're getting ready for Othello. But, and I'm going to give you a brief background to the play itself, but you're probably going to need to go online and read Spark Notes for Merchant of Venice. And then you need to get a good film version of the play. And I'm going to provide a film version of The Merchant of Venice on MrBrayman.Info. And so you'll get a chance to watch it. And then finally, I want you to read the play out loud. And I will give you a copy of Merchant of Venice. I'll post it on MrBrayman.Info. And it's got a lot of my notes and highlights and annotations in there to help you make sense out of it. But this time around, you're going to do Shakespeare more independently because you can. You are capable of it with these supports and these strategies. Right, so let's turn to the play itself, right? And we'll look at the characters first, the Dramatis Personae, right? The first one is Bassanio. He's kind of a reckless young man who's wasted his money. He's kind of a playboy and a partier, and he's fallen in love with the rich daughter, Portia. She's a daughter of a rich man who's dead, and he's kind of placed a trial on any man who would win her love. So he's going to have to meet and succeed in this challenge if he's going to get the woman of his dreams. And his friend Antonio, who is the Merchant of Venice. The play's called The Merchant of Venice, and Antonio is that merchant. One could argue whether or not he's the main character. But he's Bassanio's friend, and he agrees to borrow money from the rich Jewish money lender Shylock so that Bassanio can have this money to impress Portia. As I said, Shylock is this rich Jewish money lender who hates Antonio because the merchant has disrespected him and treated him poorly. If you remember from our history studies of the Renaissance, Jews were often the only people who could loan money at interest during the Renaissance, and so a lot of people just hated them because they owed him money, and they were doing very well financially, and people were just kind of being haters. So he agrees to loan the money to Antonio with a very special condition attached. Some of the minor characters, Launcelot Gobo, who's Shylock's clown. He kind of acts as a go-between between Antonio and Bassanio and Shylock and the women. He's kind of a funny figure. Graciano and Lorenzo are a couple of Antonio and Bassanio's friends who are going to find their own love interests in the play, right? I mean, this is a true comedy. It's going to end with 3 marriages. Portia, who I mentioned earlier, right? Her father put a condition on her marriage, right? She has these 3 caskets. You know, they're kind of small boxes the size of a toolbox. They're not caskets that you'd put a dead body in. And one of which has her picture in it. And so the suitors who want to marry her must pick correctly, agreeing that if they pick wrong, they'll never marry, right? So that's the deal. You can pick from one of these 3 caskets, and if you pick right, you can marry me, and if you pick wrong, you'll never marry anyone. Right? And then there is Nerissa, who is Portia's maidservant, and she's going to find her own love interest among the boys. Excuse me, and then there's Jessica, who is Shylock's daughter, who runs off with a Christian to get away from her oppressive father. Sorry about the typo there. And so the scenario, right? Bassanio confesses his love of Portia to Antonio, and Antonio agrees to borrow the money to help his friend impress Portia. Antonio must borrow the money because his ships are all over the world. And so in Antonio we see kind of what life was like in the Renaissance for these merchants. And the men approach Shylock, who points out how awful Antonio has been to him. And so Shylock agrees to loan the money interest-free to Antonio on one condition, that if the loan is not repaid in 3 months, that he, Shylock, will be able to take a pound of Antonio's flesh from wherever on his body he wants it. So basically the condition here is death. Like I said, I mean, Shylock has a lot of hatred towards the Christians because of the way they've treated him. So, we're going to see in this play the tensions over banking and finance and religion in Renaissance Europe. And so at Belmont, which is, near Venice, Portia waits in her mansion for a lot of foolish men come and visit her. There's a Moorish fellow, he's a Moor from Morocco, who comes and tries his hand and fails. He's kind of a goofy guy. Once again, we kind of see the European view of Moors. And finally, the man she really wants, who is Bassanio, comes to try. Right, so let's look at the themes and motifs in the play, right? The first one is risk. I want you to pay attention to the riskiness of travel and trade in the Renaissance. That's represented by Antonio. As I've mentioned before, the hatred of Jews. Pay attention to how Shylock is treated by Christian Venetians and by Shakespeare. And how does Shakespeare make him look sympathetic, and how does he make him look justified in his anger, or whether does Shylock come off as the villain? Different readers look at The Merchant of Venice and they see Shylock as a victim who's just trying to get some revenge, and others who see him just as this bloodthirsty, greedy Jew. I mean, history has read The Merchant of Venice in various ways. You also kind of get this motif of the princess and the hero, right? Bassanio has to, pass the test, to get the woman of his dreams. I mean, it's a hero story. But we also see the conflicts between Christian Europe and outsiders in their midst. So this is similar to Othello. And this is the early modern world as people are starting to move around more and start to live in more mixed, multicultural areas, especially Europe, which hadn't really been used to that from before. We see anti-Semitism and hatred and a lot of ugliness, right? I mean, a lot of times we look at the Holocaust and think, my God, how could this happen? Hitler was not the first European king or ruler or monarch or leader to, issue hateful genocidal moves against Jews. I mean, this was a very old part of European history by the time Hitler comes along. I also want you to pay attention to the idea of bonds, right? Bonds of friendship, bonds of marriage, money bonds, bonds of love, contracts. There's a lot of language in the play, a lot of extended metaphors about bonds. And I want you to look at, the theme of faith and trust, both Portia's faithfulness to her father and Gratiano and Bassanio's faithfulness to their wives. There's a suggestion at the end that the boys have cheated on the girls and the girls have cheated on the boys, although in this case it's comedic. It's not going to end the way Othello ended. And kind of a brief note here at the end, this is Shakespeare's problem play. It's always a problem for readers how we are supposed to view Shylock. Like I said, is he greedy and evil and does he hate Christians and he just wants to get rich? Or is he the victim of Christian bigotry and hatred who's just trying to get even after all that he's been through? Should we feel sorry for him? Should we feel that he, is being fair? And at the end of the play, he's going to convert to Christianity. It's kind of the punishment that Portia is going to put on him for what he's done to Antonio. He has to convert. And, is this comedic or tragic, right? To the Renaissance, this was kind of a comedic thing. And to Renaissance Christians, that's a good thing for Shylock, because he's Christian, he's going to go to heaven. But to modern readers like us, I don't know, how do we look at that? And what did Renaissance viewers think about it? And how is that the same or different from 20th century viewers and readers? And like Othello, does this play show us that Europe is just bigoted and hateful towards others? I mean, what are we supposed to think about Europeans after reading this play? Right, so, fair question. Why are we reading this? Again, I want you to be exposed to a comedy, and I want you to wrestle with whether or not this actually is a comedy, given how Shylock is treated. I want you to see how Renaissance Europe dealt with the strains of multiculturalism, and sometimes they did it well, and sometimes not well. And finally, this is a really funny play. It's got a lot of body humor in it. It's a play about boys and girls. It's a play about falling in love. It's a play about marriage and childbirth. So it's got some really good dirty jokes in it. So, enjoy. As I always say with Shakespeare, just enjoy it. Alright, and so that's it. Be sure to read the Spark Notes for The Merchant of Venice for a more detailed view. And I'm going to post the version of the play, maybe even two. I think I might actually put two versions on MrBrayman.Info. And also look at the version that I've posted on my site. Like I said, it has lots of notes and cheats and annotations to kind of help you out. And really, consider what the play shows us about money lending, banking, and trade in the early modern period.